I'm Amanda, and today I will be talking about making science human. So before I get started, I'll give just a little bit of a warning that this won't be a super traditional academic talk. I won't be doing a lot of academic theology or a lot of science. I will be talking about some practical theology and about how we do science. But mostly, I'm going to be talking about this guy named Tim. So, you might be wondering, who is Tim? Tim is someone you all know. Tim is the guy whose research is the most important thing in his life and who might have a hard time dealing with it when an experiment fails. He might be an international student who's never heard of Christianity, a postdoc who used to be an altar server before he decided he was kind of too smart to believe in God, or a Northeasterner whose friends warned him when he came to his new school that all the Catholics there would hate him for not being one of them and think he was weird. In short, Tim is someone you see every single day at work, and the odds are that Tim doesn't know God. Tim is the coworker, or maybe all of your coworkers, who seem to scrape through the day, maybe hating their work, maybe living for it, but never really stopping to ask the questions that are bigger than the ones that their experiments will answer. So my big question, and the one that I hope to answer in today's talk, is simple. How do we help Tim? How can we show him that there's a whole beautiful world out there outside the lab, and that best of all, it was made for him by a God who knows him and made him and loves him? So to answer that, it's important to first understand what it is that Tim is looking for. First, whether he knows it or not, Tim is looking for God. As we've heard many times, including at least once at this conference, our hearts are restless until they rest in God, and Tim is no exception to Augustine's rule. Second, Tim is looking for community. He might spend all his time in lab because he's just super dedicated. But if you were to go in on a Sunday night because you had to pass it yourselves and ran into him there and asked why he was still there working, he might tell you that he's there to play, not to work, because there's only so much TV he can watch at his apartment. And he might explain himself the way my Tim did. He might say, at home, there are no other people. At least since you came, there is one other person here. And at that point, you might decide that you really need to help Tim find a better community. The last thing that Tim is looking for is meaning. He's looking for meaning in general, but here I'm talking specifically about a way to find meaning in his work. What I do not mean is that Tim needs to define his own meaning and worth by his research, because a lot of Tims do way too much of that already. What I mean is that Tim needs a way to see how his work can have meaning and purpose, even when it's slow or frustrating, and even if it might never get to the point where it can actually be used to help someone. So if we know what it is that Tim needs, the next question is, can we help him find what he needs? Of course, I'm going to argue that the answer is yes, or I wouldn't be giving this talk. So before I go into all the myriad ways that we can help Tim, I want to take a minute to look at how we, in particular, as members of the Society of Catholic Scientists, are well suited to do so. First, we ourselves are looking for the same things as Tim. While we do at least know that God exists, we are always still looking for ways to grow closer to him. And while I hope we're able to find some community in our local parishes, our local Catholic student groups, or whatever that might be, there are a lot of ways in which we are still isolated. For one thing, a lot of us are probably the only Catholics in our labs, and I know some of you might be the only Catholic in your department or maybe even your college. We can certainly be friends with our lab mates and coworkers despite these differences, but it can be made more difficult when sometimes that causes us to have very different worldviews. The good news is that we do understand Tim's isolation, and if we can build more community for him, we can build it for ourselves at the same time. We also understand the struggle to find meaning in our work. We do have one advantage that Tim doesn't, which is that we know that our work can be offered up to God. But at the same time, when it comes to actually remembering that and living it out in our daily life, we need help almost as much as Tim does, which means that, again, we understand his struggle and can help ourselves even as we help him. The last point I'll make about why we should be the ones to help Tim is twofold. One, each and every Christian, including each and every one of us, has a call to share the gospel, to make God known, loved, and served. And God doesn't call us to anything that he won't also help us to do. And two, if we aren't going to step up and try to bring Christ to our coworkers, who is? Being the only Catholic around might make the idea of sharing our faith seem risky, might seem incredibly difficult. But at the same time, if we are in situations where we're the only ones around, who else can reach our coworkers? Lumen Gentium, in describing the role of the laity, states, "The laity are called in a special way to make the church present and operative in those places and circumstances where only through them can it become the salt of the earth." So as laity and as Catholics, we have a duty to share the truth of Christ. And as scientists, we owe our fellow scientists the truth, including the truth of the faith. So we don't just have the ability to help Tim, but we also have a call to do so. Which brings us to the next question. How do we help him? So here I'm going to start working backwards. While we listed Tim's needs before as God, community, and meaning, and that's right in the order of priority, that is by no means the easiest order in which to start helping Tim. If we're going to help bring him to knowledge of God, it makes sense to first establish a strong bridge of trust, and it's easier to do that if we start with the needs that he is consciously aware of, and that he might think about every day. So first, we'll look at ways that we can find meaning in our work, and then we'll look at ways that we can help Tim find meaning in his work too. So as Catholics, we have a huge advantage in finding meaning in our work, which is that simply that the church has been thinking about work, thinking about how we do work, what it should be, and how it is meaningful for hundreds of years. So even if we don't always think about it or appreciate it, there are actually a lot of things that work is helpful for and lets us do, which are conveniently listed for us in Laudato Si. Work at least should, and I think very often does, let us experience personal growth, exercise creativity, plan for the future, and develop our talents. Ideally, it should also let us live out our values, relate to others, and give glory to God. And hopefully what we're talking about today will help make those a little more applicable to our daily work. Most importantly, though, work is something that we can offer to God. Lumen Gentium also states as the laity that for all their works, prayers, and apostolic endeavors, their ordinary married and family life, their daily occupations, their physical and mental relaxation, if carried out in the Spirit, and even the hardships of life, if patiently borne, all these become spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Together with the offering of the Lord's body, they are most fittingly offered in the celebration of the Eucharist. Thus, as those everywhere who adore in holy activity, the laity consecrate the world itself to God. Remembering that our work, as with everything else in our lives, can be offered to God isn't necessarily easy, but it does help us to understand its deepest impact and to find meaning in it. Unfortunately, Tim is not quite ready for this yet, but we can still help him in other ways by considering the ways that we usually look at our work. So as with many things in life, we often define our research by its goals. So what is the goal of our scientific pursuits? Is it to make discoveries that help humanity? Is it simply to pursue the truth? Or is it to learn about God's creation? The answer, of course, is yes. The goal of science and of our work is all three of these things. But how often do we talk about anything other than the first one? I admit that the second one might not be enough to get your grant funded or your paper published. This is true. And Tim might not be ready for the last one. But what we can do is take small steps to get there. Focusing on the importance of truth for its own sake, rather than as a merely instrumental good, can help both us and Tim find meaning in our work, even if it might not be used to help anyone. At the same time, it can serve as a bridge to wonder, especially to wonder at God's creation. It can help us move from our focus on one teeny or even subatomic aspect of God's creation to a focus on the one who made it. So just as a small example of what this might look like, the next time someone says, "I can't believe we have to passage these cells again," already. Instead of agreeing and complaining, you might say, I don't know, it is kind of cool that they can grow that fast to begin with, especially when they're not in their native environment. And with just that tiny bit of work, with that tiny change, without doing anything groundbreaking, you've both drawn attention to the intricacy of creation, and you've changed a little bit of complaining and negativity into an opportunity for joy and wonder. And that's something that will make each of us and everyone around us happier every time we can do it. And the real advantage for us is, if we're on the lookout on Tim's behalf for opportunities like this to wonder at what God has created, we'll also be keeping ourselves on the lookout for opportunities for wonder. And that will help us always to praise God for everything that he has done for us. So having said that, meaning in his work isn't the only thing Tim needs. He still needs community and to know God. So how can we help him find community? When Pope Leo XIII wrote Rerum Novarum, he was worried about the loss of community among workers facing the Industrial Revolution. In response to this crisis, he proposed the formation of Catholic associations. But there aren't quite enough Catholics in science for that to be our only community, unless you have, I don't know, a conference for a society of them. And even if there were, that wouldn't help Tim. So what we can do is we can try to form community based around things that are as human as possible. What do I mean by that? We can try to form community around things that we know are good for us as human beings, intrinsically. Things like eating together, spending time outside in God's creation, getting exercise, exploring, maybe starting a lab book club, or maybe just starting a lab movie night if that's where you guys are and what makes the most sense right now for you. The important thing isn't that it be perfect. The important thing is that it be an activity that Tim will enjoy and that he can do with other people. And as your community gets stronger and you learn and grow together, you can keep moving closer to the ultimate truth. So maybe your Tim is a philosophy nerd, and you can start right off with a debate group. Maybe your Tim wants to read more books in English to practice, so asks you for recommendations and says he likes mysteries. So you recommend Agatha Christie and plan to recommend Father Brown if he likes those. Or maybe your Tim is kind of unfamiliar with American culture at all, and it's hard to even find a story that you both know and can talk about. So you start off by just watching Star Wars together as you build a shared cultural context. You can take tiny steps forward, regardless of where your starting point is. Ultimately, it isn't us who will lead Tim to God anyway. We can inform, but only the Holy Spirit can convince. But if Christ could feed thousands of people with a few fish and loaves of bread, we know that he can lead Tim to God and to himself, even if it starts with a movie and a bowl of popcorn. The last point that I will make today is about Tim's greatest need, his need for God, and a key reason that I think scientists in particular suffer from not knowing God. First, everyone suffers from not knowing God. We need him, plain and simple. Second, though, I think scientists in particular need God because our profession, perhaps more than any other secular profession, is supposed to be focused on truth. And it's really hard to do good science in a world in which scientists are actually less likely, even than the general public, to believe in God who is truth. How can we pursue truth with a little t if we reject the capital T truth, God himself? Third, as researchers, it is very, very important that we know that there is something, or actually someone out there, who's vastly more important than our research. When researchers allow themselves to be consumed and defined by what happens in their labs, the consequences can be devastating. On the other hand, when we know that God is real and is vastly greater than our work, we can look at our work with a more measured perspective and maintain our peace even during frustrating times. I think this last feature can actually be an extremely powerful means of leading others to Christ, a constant witness that we live with our lives. When we are the only ones in our workplace who know that God is real, we are also the only ones who know that there's something out there infinitely greater than the problems we're facing in lab. And other people will notice if we try to live that out. I know they will notice because my Tim has. In lab one morning, after he was so stressed he could barely sleep the entire night because he was worried about work, he came in and asked me, "Why are you always so happy? It seems like you are good at maintaining inner peace, and I need to be better at that so I can sleep." I love explaining the church to my lab mates when they ask questions, which happens way more than I ever thought it would. And I've tried very consciously to maintain a happy, peaceful presence in lab, partially as a witness to the fact that there is something greater and we shouldn't let ourselves be crushed by the pressures of lab. But I didn't really think that anyone would notice, or that it would make all that much of a difference, even if I could explain the entire gospel. But my Tim did notice, and that doesn't mean that he's getting baptized tomorrow. And it doesn't even necessarily mean that he's getting baptized before he graduates. But we're building a bridge of trust between the two of us that can lead him to trust the church. And maybe when he graduates, he'll be a postdoc with one of you, and you can keep building more bridges. Bridges of curiosity, of seeking, and ultimately of belief in Christ. So on behalf of my Tim and of all the other Tims out there, I'm asking today that you help them. And I'm telling you that you are exactly the right person to do so. So thank you for all you've done so far. Thank you for listening, and thank you in advance for helping Tim. I will say real quick, I did an acknowledgement slide because I didn't know that we apparently aren't doing that. I would like to say thanks really quick to all the people who listened to me because I've never done a talk before and listened to a practice version of this. And my lab mates for always being open to and curious about the faith, and my PI for letting me coming, even though he doesn't necessarily, and supporting me coming here, even though he doesn't necessarily always understand why. And I do have, the last thing is that I have a list of practical things that we can do, because I did promise practical suggestions in the abstract. And if you don't want to write them all down, even if you like any of them, the QR code will bring you to a list of them online that you can also edit. So you can add ideas that you have. Or you know what, even if you had an idea and you tried it and it failed epically, add that too with a note, and then we'll learn from each other and we'll know what to try and what to not try. And all will be good.
I'd like to get your thoughts on the role of the liturgy and bringing our science into the liturgy. You know, I think I went one time to La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, and there was all these sort of like forms from nature that are in Gaudi's architectural work. And, you know, I've heard that in the past in Christian artwork in medieval cathedrals, there was like almost like scientific symbols sometimes in the ecclesial artwork. And yeah, what are your thoughts on bridging the language of science, the world that we live in, more closely with the liturgy and Christian praise?
To me, I think one of the most powerful means of doing that is through the Liturgy of the Hours. If you're on a day that's common of doctors, you're going to have the readings in praise of wisdom. It'll say, "Simply I learned from wisdom, and ungrudgingly do I share. For to men she is an unfailing treasure. Those who have this treasure win the friendship of God, to whom the gifts they have from discipline commend them." Things like that. And I think that's extremely reassuring as a scientist. The gifts that we have from discipline, from all of this work, they mean something, right? We're learning virtue. We're not just learning the 10,000th way that this reaction does not make the expected product. So I think definitely the hours often. As far as the Mass, I mean, the Gold Mass that most of us hold in our chapters is obviously a good example of a way to do that, of a way to have something that celebrates what we learn from science and the ways that it helps us to understand God's creation.
Amanda, just a comment. I want to thank you with all my heart for having reminded me and all of us of the little things. I think sometimes when you stay in this field for so long, you're always trying to enter an intellectual debate with an opinion and all of this. And we forget that the first law in Christianity is Christ met people where they are on the road to Mass. So I want to thank you for a really beautiful talk, and like St. Teresa for reminding us of the little things of how they all start there. God bless.
Thank you so much.
I'm not sure how to, but being Catholic, you're kind of universal. You know, people know Catholics, even if they're not Catholics. They have their opinions, and it's not in a negative way normally. It's not in a positive way. It's just that they kind of have their theories and stuff. So when you talk to somebody, well, you're at Notre Dame, so pretty Catholic, but the country sees Notre Dame as kind of a normal, non-religious school. I mean, it's football, it's all the other things too. So when you talk to somebody, does Catholicism in your world, not Notre Dame, but just in your normal work and come up in the sense that they now know where you're coming from if you mention Catholicism, or do you talk about Christianity? How do you personally kind of adjust that? Because I find in my conversations, once I mention I'm Catholic, and I'm comfortable with it totally, I don't even feel offended with anything they can say about Catholicism, negative, positive, anything. Is that the experience for you? In other words, with the uniqueness of Catholicism, the universality of it?
So for me, my lab is mostly non-Catholic. I'm kind of the only one who's been open at all about the fact that I am. And there's a lot of curiosity, partially because there's not a lot of understanding. So like I ended up getting to explain kind of like the story of salvation history, almost start to finish, because I kept getting asked questions that all started with, why do Americans give each other gifts at Christmas? And I said, well, you know, we believe that Jesus came to save us. He is the greatest gift. I started there, but he kept asking, so I kept explaining. And we started at Adam, we went all the way through Christ, more or less. Skipped a few pages. But I think there is a lot of, I don't want to say ignorance, but there is, I think, a loss of a cultural consciousness of what the church is. A lot of my grad students didn't know, you know, like what Easter was until we had off on this random Monday. And I'm still not sure that they necessarily, they know a little bit more. I made them Easter baskets. This is, I do what I can. But I think we have really lost as a society just a base understanding. So I'm not sure, unfortunately, that it really is all that universal to people anymore, even at Notre Dame, if that answers the question.
Amanda, back. Hi, I just wanted to say thank you. Before I joined the monastery, my name was Tim, and I also was Tim in high school and beginning of college, and I was a math teacher, the biology teacher, the physics teacher, who helped in various ways bring me to this conference and among other things, and I'm sure we each have our own stories similar, so thank you for helping me remember and be grateful for those people today.
Thanks.
Amanda, I just was thinking of one of our kids who went away to grad school, and we started calling him the apostle to the Chinese graduate students, because he would go, he had one of these students in his class. The kid knew a lot more math than my son. My son knew a lot more English. So they hung out together, and eventually he kept going to their meetings. Eventually he had the whole crew of them coming to Mass with him, mostly to experience Western life for whatever reason. And but as you said, it was just this very, originally he took them pumpkin picking and apple picking, whatever the holidays were. And then finally they said, yeah, how come you're never here on Sunday? Why don't you ever do stuff with us on Sunday? He goes, well, I'm at Mass. Well, can we go? Yeah. So I think that's an excellent idea. Thank you for your talk. It was excellent.
Thanks, and that sounds awesome. I'm glad that worked out so well.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question related to your idea that there's a certain amount of cultural decomposition, which means that people don't understand some of the basic reference points with Christianity. Isn't there also that same cultural decomposition that happens within and among the Catholic scientists, especially the younger people? I mean, do you all know each other? Do you all hang out with each other? And to get to the actual main point is, do you all marry each other? And do you think it might not be a bad idea to have SCS start a dating service?
So I have many soapboxes. This may or may not be one of them, so I will try not to step onto it. I think that is tremendously important. I think if you want to look at the rise of loneliness and the isolation and mental health problems that have apparently skyrocketed among grad students, I think probably you could, I didn't look into the demographics because I didn't think I would have time, but I think probably a lot of that is linked to how many grad students are married versus how many used to be, is probably a decent factor in that. And if Steve's open to it, I would support.
Amanda, thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Bob Horton, and I've been a professor for 44 years. And I think, in addition to, striving for, excellence in science research and teaching, just to let grad students, postdocs, colleagues know that we care for them. To me, that's the beginning point, a point of opportunity to talk on things that are important in life, like our faith, for example. But for me, the way that it really played out in a very concrete way was to take the step of not only being sympathetic and listening and maybe offering some words of encouragement, but to say, may I pray for you? And so many times, especially with non-Christian, international usually, they didn't even know the word prayer, what it meant. But praying and God answering those prayers, for me, from my observation, from the input, the feedback, very quickly, God will answer the prayers for unbelievers, non-believers, people that aren't familiar with Christianity or Catholicism, very quickly and personally and deeply, that really supercharges their hunger to learn more. Who is God? And then opportunities to continue the discussion or Bible study or things like that, that would let them come to know who's behind that personal experience that they had. Anyway, I'll keep it real short, but you're right on the money that we can do as Catholic scientists. We can do really search the truth in our science, search for really good science education, research, but also be the witness also in proclaiming that the gospel as the doors open for us there. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I just wanted to say that at our last conference in Mundelein, one of the speakers had met his wife at one of our conferences. They were both there. They're both members of SCS. So actually, we are doing a little bit, but maybe. I'm not an expert on these things. I can imagine there might be some practical dangers to having an SCS dating service or something, but maybe this is something that could be discussed at our meeting this afternoon. If not a dating service, maybe ways to increase like a social outreach. The chapters, for example, could have events and that are where it's encouraged for non-Catholics and non-scientists to come to it or something. I mean, we can discuss this afternoon of ways to increase our social outreach, so to speak. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. It was very interesting. One of the aspects what you were mentioning when you were talking to Tim, that you had to go from, this Adam all the way to Jesus. And I've noticed in talking to non-Catholics that it seems like there's a danger if you introduce your Catholic faith that you have to be an expert on Catholicism. Otherwise, they have questions and you have to answer as a perfect apologist, as somebody that has all the answers. So I guess how do you see that aspect of your understanding of the Catholic faith and the fact that you're opening yourself up to all sorts of questions and all sorts of debates that you may not have the answers to?
I think for one, I've been very fortunate in that I did my undergrad at Notre Dame. I did a summer program based on essentially helping high schoolers walk through their faith. And we had an oral exam for that class, and it was explain salvation history from Adam through Christ. So I had been trained for this. I was like, all right, thank you, Dr. Haas. Okay. But
I guess for everybody else.
I'm going. Sorry.
Yeah.
So I think certainly it can be an inspiration for us to try to be prepared for things that we might be asked. We have a little bit of a small group at school of STEM grad students who care about evangelization, and what we've been doing is going through different topics. So like we talked about abortion, talked about we have a list. We haven't gotten very far through the list yet. We talked about abortion, then we switched to talking about the reading that we were reading, so that makes sense. But I think also people will generally, if they're open enough to be asking the question, I don't think they'll be repulsed by you having the humility to say, I don't know, let's ask Wikipedia, or wherever we're asking, right? Maybe Catholic Answers instead. But I think there's been a lot of things, like I've been asked things about like the church in China and like, what order runs this particular hospital? And I'm like, I don't know that hospital exists. I don't know anything about it. But I've said, let's go find out. So we went and looked it up, and I said, they're I don't know. I don't remember what order they were, but I can explain a little bit about what they are if I even know what they are, right? So I think being willing to admit that you don't have all the answers is in and of itself a proof that you're not just pious, high and mighty on your high horse or something, right? You can say, I don't know, let's learn together. And somebody can tell me if I'm wrong. It might have been Newman that said, 1,000 questions do not make one doubt. That's also, I think, a good witness that you can have questions. You don't have to know everything, and you can still be Catholic.